OK, since we're a little bit behind schedule already, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the next lecture. So as an introduction, I'm Samvit. Huh? Oh, and this is Evan. He doesn't have a mic, so I'm saying his name for him. Yeah, so our lecture is going to be on HTML and CSS. You might have already seen this before, but again, we're going to start off a little bit slow and then speed up gradually. So, and if this is new to you, don't worry, because again, we'll have the lectures on our website for you to review. Before we jump in, let's talk a little bit about why HTML and CSS is important to learn. So arguably, the thing in website design is conveying information to a user in a way that's like nice to see. And HTML and CSS are going to be our core two things for front-end development for that purpose. So here's a website that you might be familiar with. And here is the HTML and CSS kind of extracted from it. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. You can basically just think of it as the language that your web browser is reading through in order to describe what web page you're looking at. A common analogy people will use is that HTML is like, or if like a web page was like a fully formed person, then HTML is the skeleton that's holding the structure together. And CSS is like the bells and whistles, like the nice flesh that makes it appealing to look at. Fortunately, the main idea of this lecture is going to be that HTML is really simple. And you can actually just think of it as a bunch of nested boxes or containers. So let's see what that actually means using this example from XKCD. All HTML is really describing on this web page are these containers. So here's a big one. Here's the container that contains the entire web page. Here's one that contains a little bit more closely all the information on the web page. Here are three containers contained within that that have the nav bar, the title, and the actual content, and so on and so on. So let's look into the code to see how this is actually done. Here's a really, really simple website. The code on the left generates this kind of bare-bones looking website on the right. So let's walk through the code and see how every part of it affects the site that we see. So first, in any HTML document, you want to include this header thing called doctype HTML. It basically just tells your web browser to use the latest version of HTML. It's pretty easy to forget, but it's kind of important, so try to remember. Next, we move on to our first HTML element. And you'll see that it has this kind of opening and closing structure. And of course, that's because the elements are containers, like I mentioned before. So the key structure of HTML elements is that they have an opening tag, which is just the name of it with these bracket things, and then a closing tag, which is the same thing, but with a /. And anything that's contained within it will go in between. So pretty intuitive. And you can see that container structure right here, where we have the HTML container is containing both the head and the body. And then both of those contain other things as well. I think the syntax for HTML is pretty simple, as long as you keep in mind that it has to respect the fact that it's a container, right? So you can't have this kind of thing where you're starting something, starting another thing, and then closing the first thing before you close the other one. So this is basically the only thing to remember. Just make sure that it's nested properly, and you should be fine. All right, I'll pause here for questions. If there are any. OK, cool. So let's go back to the code and look at things a little bit more deeply. So I mentioned the structure of this thing, but I didn't actually tell you what it does. This one is called the root, and it's just going to contain all things in the web page. And the syntax is pretty simple. It's just HTML. Within those, you're always going to include the head and the body. Within the head, you store what's called metadata. So metadata is things that aren't going to be displayed on the website, but they'll help it like do what it needs to do. So for example, we'll include the title here. And you'll see that it's not actually on the document. It's not in like heading or paragraph, but it's in the top here in this tab thing. Other things you'll include in there are links to other files like style sheets, which Evan will talk about later in the lecture. Next is the body, and this is going to contain everything that's actually displayed. So that means the heading and the paragraph, which have the following names for their tags. So as a quick stopping point, the HTML tags that we've covered so far are HTML, head, body, the headers, and the paragraphs. I also included these other ones, div and span. They're pretty important, and I'll talk about it in a little bit, but they're kind of like your generic. If you don't know what else to do, you use those tags. There's also this notion of attributes for HTML elements. So we see this like plain structure here that I showed you before. But what if you wanted to like modify your element in a way that you couldn't just do by adding like text or adding like something inside of it? What you do is within the opening tag, you add an attribute. So an attribute will be defined by putting the name of the attribute and then setting it equal to something within a string. Attributes, and that's the value. So some common places that you might be using attributes. One very common one is inserting links. So the syntax for link is just A. Stands for anchor, if you're curious. To insert a link, you'll add the attribute for href, and the value is just going to be the link. So here's an example of that. If you click on this link, it'll go to weblab.mit.edu. Another really common one is going to be images. So for image, to insert an image, you'll go to the source attribute, src, and then you set that equal to the name of the image, wherever that is, like relative to your directory. Now, there's something a little bit weird here with this opening and closing thing for images, because when you have an image, you're not really going to put anything inside of it. You're not going to put text of your image, or you might, but probably not in this way. So instead, what HTML lets you do is get rid of the closing tag entirely and make what's called a self-closing tag. So for this, it'll display the same thing that it did before, just an image. But because you don't need anything inside of the opening and closing, you just make it one tag. Oh, another thing to keep in mind, as I mentioned before, you have to navigate to the correct like file name. So if your HTML file was in like the same directory, like directly as your image or GIF or whatever, you can just put it like this. But if it's within another folder, then you need to update that accordingly. Oh, another quick thing is, in the case that your browser doesn't display an image correctly, it's good practice to just add alt text so that maybe a user who's like confused when they don't see a picture will like understand. This is also good for like semantics. If you're just like reading through your code and not looking at the web page, maybe good to like label things with alt text and things like that. Oh, shoot. I'll stop here for questions once again. Okay, cool. All right, some other common elements are lists. List is pretty simple. You can have ordered or unordered lists, and they contain the list elements. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. OK, back to the ones that I mentioned before, div and span. So div and span are going to be your like go-to generic elements. And all they really do, or they don't do anything like specific, all they do is just group together other elements. So they're just like plain containers. The difference between them is that div will group like a block section, while span will group something that's like in line. So if you wanted to select, like, let's say you had like a paragraph and you wanted to select like one thing to maybe like style it, then you could use span around that like word or like a couple words, and then it would stay in line. Whereas if you use div, then it would like try to like do a line break or something like that. So here's an example. I have two divs and two spans. So as you can see, like the divs are stacked on top of each other, whereas the spans are, they respect, like, they're not stacked anymore. So if we wanted to add a div to our old website, we could just, I don't know, box our body around with the div. You might be wondering, like, oh, like, why did I do that? It doesn't really do anything. But now we have this nice box where we can just refer to like the div, and then it'll refer to both the heading and the paragraph. And this becomes helpful when you're doing styling and stuff. Evan will talk about that more. Yeah. So I threw a whole lot of tags at you, and maybe not like that much time to remember all of them. But don't worry, because Google is going to be your best friend with this. It's not that hard to find HTML elements and like what they're best used for. You can go to this site called MDN Web Docs, and it has like pretty good descriptions of all the elements. All right, I'll stop here for questions again. OK, cool. OK, so as I mentioned before, div is like a very generic element, and you're probably going to want to use it a lot when you're doing like styling and like referring to like groups of things like that. And at some point, I'm sure you'll wonder, like, why not just use div for everything? And there's a couple of reasons. If we look at the MDN Web Docs, actually, they say that div should only be used when there's no other semantic element that's appropriate. And a semantic element is just one that's like labeled with what exactly it's supposed to do. So for example, like navbar, that's a semantic element. It says it's just nav. Header, footer, section, these are all just better things to use. One is for like readability, because maybe you come back to your project like a week later and you forgot like what all these divs are supposed to do. But then if you have semantic elements, then it's easier to like parse your code. It's also helpful for like web crawlers and bots that are just looking through your website. Yeah. So to sum up, don't just use div. It's useful, it's helpful. It's like the first thing you'll go to. But try to use MDN Web Docs to find the element that best suits your needs. All right, this has been our intro to HTML. And I'll pass it on to Evan to talk about CSS.
Okay. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's used for styling your browser, and cascading stands for sort of how the rules are applied, because they're applied in sort of other rules override others depending on the order they're written. So back to the Café Bon Appetit website, this is what it looks like with CSS and HTML. But if you take away the CSS, then you end up with something like this. And you can test this out for yourself in your browser if you just go to the website and then open developer tools, and you can go into the head of the HTML and delete all the style sheets which are linked. So back to our analogy, CSS sort of adds a look to your skeleton that HTML gives you. So here's what a basic CSS rule set looks like. So at the top, you have your selector. So this lets you indicate which HTML element you're trying to style. This might be something like div or h1, so an actual HTML element, but it could also be something like a class or an ID, which we'll talk about in a sec. After that, you also have the property, which is, in this case, color. And this selects what property you're going to adjust with your style, and then you add the actual value that you're going to adjust. So let's see what this looks like. If we have our h1, or if we have our heading and paragraph here, and OK, we'll add one more line, which we'll use later. Then if we add the div styling sheet, which has the color set to red and the font set to Arial, we see that it changes from the serif font to, from the serif font to the red Arial. And I have to join the Zoom real quick. All right. So yeah. So if you add in the style sheet of div, then you change the font and color to red Arial. Okay. Now, if you now one more thing we can do is instead of doing the selector for div, is we can do a selector for class. So in this case, if we create a class, and the syntax for that is you just do a dot and then you follow it with the class name, then instead of selecting all divs within the HTML document, you can select only those which you indicate with the class info. And so in this case, you see that only info is red and Arial, whereas paragraph is still serif and black. Another one you can use is something called an ID. And so ID is different. You put in the attribute ID. And on the CSS side, you put in a hashtag to indicate that it's an ID. So in this case, it sort of looks like they do the exact same thing. But we can talk a little bit about how they're different. So for the first thing is if you have a given HTML element, you can only have one ID. So within the ID attribute, you can only put in a single ID. Whereas for classes, you can list out a bunch of classes spaced out. And if you put in multiple classes, like class 1, class 2, class 3, this can imply the style from class 1, 2, and 3. Whereas with an ID, you only get the style from the single ID. Furthermore, IDs must be only given to a single element on the HTML document. So you can't have one div with a given ID and then another div that has the same ID to apply the same styling. If you want to do that, you have to use a class, and you can place the class on multiple different elements. And the syntax is, of course, different, the hashtag versus the dot. One more thing to talk about in terms of these IDs and classes is sort of the hierarchy. So this is sort of the cascading part of the CSS. And so the lowest specificity is when we have elements, and we select, for example, we selected the div and added styling to it. And the highest specificity is when you do inline styling. And so that's with something called the style attribute, but we don't usually use it because it's bad practice. So on this hierarchy, we see that IDs are higher than classes. And what this means is if you have some CSS code like this, where you have a class like info, and you set the color to red, and then let's say you have the lower specificity div, which sets the color to blue, then the div with the class info, okay, wait, ignore the paragraph. That should actually be blue. But the div with info, which has class info, takes on the color red because the class takes higher precedence over the HTML element. And we see that the Arial font family is still applied, and not on the paragraph, but on the info still. Okay, so that's wrong, but my bad. Yeah, so that's the hierarchy. We go from elements, then you apply your class styling, and then if you have an ID, the ID styling overrides any of that. So best practice is to mainly use classes because they're the most flexible. You can use them, you can reuse them so that you don't have to rewrite your CSS over and over again. And it's your highest specificity over your general element selectors. Right. Are there any questions on CSS? Right. If not, we can briefly look at how you actually put this into your website. So if we go back to our Hello HTML, we have this head section, which is where we want to put our metadata. And so that's where we link our style sheet. So we link our style sheet style.css that we just wrote, and then that'll put in the style. So then if you want to apply any classes that we wrote within the style sheet, such as my class, then you can just put it in as an HTML attribute, and then you should get everything that you want. And this is, and you can link multiple style sheets as well. If you have a style sheet where you specifically focus on writing on styling fonts, and then another for specifically styling how you want things ordered with respect to each other, you could have different style sheets to organize that, and then apply them all at once within the HTML document. So I guess in conclusion, HTML is your nested boxes, and CSS is your listed descriptions. And you put it all together to get your website. Are there any questions? If not, then you can put more feedback for this. Yeah, you can put your feedback here.